Hi, welcome to my crash course of an introduction to Edexcel politics, looking at specifically Parliament. This is supposed to be a nice quick video that will help you if you've just started teaching politics and you want a quick rundown of the specification, and also hopefully I can point out a few pitfalls and problems that I came across in the last couple of years of teaching it. I'm obviously not from the exam board, so this is just coming from experience, so you might want to check some of these things if you're unsure. Just to start off with, obviously start with the specification. That is going to be your guide and your base of where to go. So I've just put the specification on the screen for you here, and you can see it's got the key terminology, so your students need to know those words, and then it's got the general structure of the knowledge they need to know. I tend to follow that mostly in order, except when there are a few areas where things are able to unite or things work really well together, which I will show you with committees later on. I highly recommend going to look at the AS and A level Getting Started guide. That has a specification in much more detail. It also gives you debates that you might come across, and it's just a nice way to really get started, because the spec, as you can see, can be quite bare, whereas the Getting Started guide has quite a lot on it. We're now quite a few years into this course, so you can find lots of resources on the Edexcel website which are really useful. You know, examiner reports, they've got some example answers from students, so do look at that as well. So things to be aware of when you're teaching the Parliament topic in particular. Know the base knowledge they need to start the topic. There are so many words that we're going to use that the kids aren't going to know about. I actually teach this second in the course. I teach Constitution first, but I do know some people that start with Parliament. I have toyed with the idea of starting with Parliament because it can be quite interesting and it's a really good way to know the topic. And finally, my big piece of advice when it comes to teaching politics and Parliament is you'll always learn more. Like, there are examples coming out of our ears at the minute, so do just keep an eye out. Don't feel like it's a finished product when you've made your lesson for Parliament. Always be keeping the kids interested in the up-to-date stuff that's happened. Brexit brought a wealth of examples of things that hadn't happened in years, so that was really useful for Parliament. There is my list of lessons, so you can see I cover it in about 12 lessons, not including maybe some exam practice that I might do. And that tends to be the order I've done it in. Those names aren't perfect, some of them are probably a bit misnomers. So when it says structure of the House of Commons, I think I actually cover the power of the House of Commons in that. So on the left there, I've pulled out the spec headings, and I'm just going to talk through what I do for each of those headings. So first of all, the spec tells us we must cover the structure and the role of the Lords and the Commons. I start with addressing what Parliament is. You would be surprised how many students don't really understand the concept of Parliament and legislators. They need to know the word legislation because that helps them understand, you know, the structure of power in our country. And I really preload a lot of keywords. So I've said it there: legislation, ministers, MPs, Commons, Lords. They will come to you with such a variety of knowledge. Don't make the mistake of just throwing them into Parliament and expecting them to understand when you talk about the legislative process. They need to have that base knowledge of words. There's an example of a task I do. I've stolen this from, I think it's Simon Beale for history, but I now use it for most of my lessons, to be honest. And it's just a very basic background that I've taken from somewhere about Parliament. So I'll do the verbal spiel, but I'll also have like a written copy for them so they can refer back to that. When I'm covering the structure and the role of the Lords and the Commons, I'm thinking about how does Parliament work. I look at the key roles. So my main task here is I have all of the roles written out. You've got the Speaker, Leader of the Opposition, Whips, Ministers, Frontbenchers, Backbenchers, and I have the same one for the Commons. The Commons, I do a lesson, I do another lesson on the Lords, and they pull out the strengths and weaknesses of each of these positions. The reason why I do that is because it's very much you just need to know this, so I wanted them to do something with the information. But the strengths and weaknesses allows them to think about evaluating skills quite early in the course. So thinking about, well, why is this good? Why is this bad? So when they get a question on perhaps the significance of backbenchers, evaluate the extent to which backbenchers are powerful or something like that. They've already got that base knowledge of, well, I already know backbenchers are really good because they can do X, Y, and Z. So that's why I do it as a strengths and weaknesses. And also it's really handy to have this as a reference. If you do USA in year 2, you can, like, sheet to sheet compare the roles of things like the Speaker, which is completely different in America than it is in the UK. So that's a nice base knowledge for them to have. Really good example to bring in here is John Bercow, obviously no longer the Speaker, but he was fantastic when it came to increasing the use of urgent questions. He used Erskine May, which is an authoritative work, to stop the Brexit vote. His general control of the House was really interesting, and also he wasn't made a peer after leaving his role as Speaker, which is really unusual. So him alone provides you with endless examples about Parliament. So I definitely have a little look into him and try and get him into lessons. Continuing on with the structure and role, I do cover functions of the Lords and functions of the Commons as well in a single lesson, and I then consider the effectiveness of both of those. Knowing the key differences here is really important, like between the Lords and the Commons. They need to understand that the Lords' weaknesses are different to the Commons' weaknesses. Why do the Lords exist? So this is a really big part of the topic, and there's lots of elements to untangle here. What do they do? Are they good at it? But being the Commons and the Lords and being separate, you've now got to kind of navigate two different fields. One of the things I found here, pitfall, is knowing the difference between primary and secondary legislation. This is still something I grapple with, and I think I understand the bare bones of this, but trying to explain to students when you're not really sure yourself is really difficult. So if you're teaching Parliament, I definitely recommend spending some time looking up primary and secondary legislation. There's lots of little caveats with secondary legislation. The general understanding is primary legislation is like new laws, whereas secondary legislation tends to be adaptations to existing laws. And secondary legislation won't necessarily be debated by the Commons. They still have to vote on it, but the Lords will do a lot of the scrutiny on it, and then it will just go to the Commons for a vote. That's because the Commons has too much work to do. They can't do everything. So just a heads up, that was definitely a sticking point for me when I was talking about the Lords scrutinising secondary legislation. I kind of understood what it was, and the kids were like, well, what about this? What about this? So be prepared for that. I also find these lessons a really good example, a really good time, to bring examples in. I'm constantly thinking of how can I get them to have examples, because weirdly, it's actually really difficult to think of examples when it comes to the Commons and the Lords when you first start. I mean, I'm in my fourth year of teaching Parliament now, so I've got shed loads of examples finally. But when I first started, when I was looking for like an example of a really effective delaying tactic, or I was looking for an example of a really effective law, or a law that the Lords had adapted, or an amendment that had gone through, it's really quite difficult. So where you can, try and give those to the kids, because if I can't find it, the kids probably are going to struggle to find it as well. So in this particular case, you can see the worksheet on the bottom right. I give them the functions, there's lots of examples at the bottom, and they select what the example shows. Is it legislation? Is it scrutiny? Is it debating? So it's quite a simple task, but it's a good way to get them to know stuff. And then I'll change that yearly if I've got better examples. The next bit of the spec talks about the comparative power of the Lords and the Commons, so you've got to compare them. This reiterates the previous lesson, so I make sure I really cover what powers do the Commons have and the Lords don't, and vice versa. So, for example, the Commons has power of the purse, the ability to kill a bill, they can issue a vote of no confidence, whereas the Lords can delay legislation, they tend to have more expertise, they're not elected, that kind of stuff. So it's a really good time to lay that out. Be careful not to fall into the trap of suggesting the Lords are useless. It's really easy for the students to walk away being like, well, what's the point in the Lords? Absolute waste of time, The Commons do all the hard work, but actually they need to understand the power of delaying. My kids, in the first couple of years I taught this, fell into the trap and were like, oh yeah, delaying, useless, they can't actually stop it. And I tried to explain, well, actually, if you can delay, it puts a stop to a government's plans. They might then adapt it because they want to get something through quickly and seem like they're effective. So delaying can be a really powerful measure. The fact they're not elected can be a powerful thing. They're not subject to political whims, they don't have to win votes, they can put in difficult legislation they might not previously do. The example I use there is the Children's and Families Act of 2014. The Lords put an amendment in that banned smoking in cars with children. And we use that as an example to say, well, the Lords could do that because they don't have to worry about the voter, whereas the Commons were less likely to do that. And then if you can link this learning back to the House of Lords reform that you would have covered in the Constitution, or if you're going to cover that, it's a good point to say, oh, this is really important, we're going to come back to this issue of the Lords and how we might not think it's the most useful and it's not elected. That's going to come up with Tony Blair and further attempts to talk about the reform of the Lords. In the blue box at the bottom there, then, I've got the Parliament Act that kind of make the Lords who they are today. So the 1911 Act and the 1949 Act. They define the power of the Lords, like clarifying that money bills must be passed within a month. They talk about the ability to delay for a year. Some bills aren't actually affected by the Parliament Acts, but for the most part they are. And then you've got the House of Lords Act, which I've mentioned up there with the House of Lords reform. So this reforms the Lords to remove all but 92 hereditary peers. And other Lord reforms have also followed, so we can now suspend members. There's a rule that, that when a bishop, because there's a specific number of bishops in the Lords, when a bishop steps down, if there is a female available, it must be a female that takes their place. So there's some more interesting Lords reforms that are coming through as well that are kind of modernising the House somewhat. And then here's some examples that I do. I literally give these to the kids to stick in because it's so difficult finding Lords examples that show effectiveness. The one that I always come back to is in the right here, which is the Lords voting to delay the tax credit cuts, which actually led to George Osborne deciding not to do it. So that's a brilliant example of delaying power. But, you know, if you want to pause the video and steal these ideas, that's absolutely fine. I'm always on the lookout, always, for Lords examples because they are like gold dust. And when you get a really good one, like the tax credit cuts U-turn, it's brilliant. After this is the legislative process. I teach this very factually to begin with, literally what are the processes, what are the advantages and disadvantages to each level. So things like the committees kind of come in slightly here. We talk about how they don't have to accept their reports, they don't have to add amendments if they don't want to, that kind of stuff. If you teach US politics here, I actually make the worksheet look the same in the UK as I do in the US, so I can do a direct comparison because there are some subtle differences. Actually, they're not that subtle. There are some big differences about when the committee stage comes in, when they're allowed to vote on certain readings. That does change the political nature of the voting system. So heads up on that one. And always looking out for examples of specific types of laws. So I've got down here like huge government rebellions are really good to keep an eye out for. In the Iraq War, 84 Labour MPs voted against it. That was really interesting because it was even though they might have been backbenchers, it was the government party voting against the government. 21 Tory MPs voting against Brexit. They're subsequently thrown out of the party, if you remember that. It was a big hoo-ha. That kind of stuff, I'm always keeping like a check in my brain, thinking, oh yeah, I need to keep an eye on that. Lord's successes we've talked about already, so the Children's and Families Act and the U-turn on family tax credit cuts. Lord's failures, blocking the hunting ban. I really hate that example because I use it every year and the kids reference it and it's 2004. That was a long time ago. So I'm keeping an eye out for something a little bit better than that that's easy to understand and digest. But examples of Lords not being able to elicit change, there's definitely some Brexit ones in there. I'm thinking off the top of my head now, probably, I know there was an amendment that was tried to put through to protect child refugees from the Lords that wasn't accepted, so I might have another look for that one. Successful private member bills for the legislative process are really good. There aren't many, and if they are, they tend to be quite undramatic. The big one is the Abortion Act, I think 1967, So keep an eye out for private members bills that are successful, and there's some really good stats on the Institute of Government that tell you how many private member bills get passed compared to not, and it's like minuscule. But also keep an eye out for bipartisan support of laws. We don't tend to use the word bipartisan in UK politics, it's more US, but it's good to note when there are times that things kind of go all the way through so the kids can understand Parliament isn't just about you versus them. There's also some collaboration in there. In the legislative process, I then look at committees. This actually comes under the next specification bullet point because it's a way of scrutinising the government. This was a topic I absolutely dreaded the first couple of years I taught it, and then last year I remade the lesson, and I thought, well, I'm going to really deep dive into committees because it can be quite confusing. It didn't help that I taught America first, so I know a lot about US committees but not about UK committees. First of all, we need to know what committees are. There's different types of them, so you've got the departmental select committees, you've got the law committees, the joint committees. There's lots of stuff going on they need to know about. Strengths and weaknesses of those, so what are their actual powers. And if you're doing US as well, be aware of that confusion because they have the same names for different types. So select committees in the UK are permanent, in the US they're not. So just be aware of that kind of distinction. Public bill committees are only created whenever there is a law, they then disappear when the law is over. And also have a clear example of how they show impact or lack of impact. This was a part I just found really overwhelming because it was really hard to find evidence of committees because committees' impact often is highlighting something, then the media will pick up on it, and then the government will change their mind because the media's picked up on it. So it's quite hard to see that connection sometimes. The Institute of Government does have a brilliant page on committees, so definitely worth having a read. It's quite overwhelming, it's quite long, but you know, if you're a couple of years into teaching then and you want to freshen yourself up a bit, they're really brilliant. The Windrush scandal, the committee played a huge role in the investigation of that. And then the liaison committee is quite useful because you can talk about how they interrogate the Prime Minister. But again, it's never as simple as you want. I always want to be like, oh, Google, example of liaison committee having an impact, and you can never find what you want. So when you find those examples, hoard them and hold on to them because they're gold dust. And finally, the last bit of the Parliament spec is the ways in which the executive interacts with the legislative. So this is going to be a lot of overlap. By the time you've covered everything else, you will have touched on how Parliament interacts with the executive, because you would have looked at the Lords stopping laws, you would have looked at Parliament stopping laws, you'd have covered rebellions, you'd have covered a bit of committees. So just be aware that it's quite a nice topic to kind of re-emphasise bits that you think kids might not have understood. I use this to go into more detail. So I look at select committees if I haven't already done enough in my previous committees lesson. A really good example recently is Dominic Cummings talking about COVID. That's a fantastic example of committees using their investigation powers. So I'm going to go away and kind of add that to my lesson for this year. I then cover the role of the opposition. I cover it very, very briefly at the start in my structure and role. I talk about the opposition, but in this case I look at successful moments of the opposition. So it's really good here to have like question time, but PMQs. This always lets my kids down because they will talk about Prime Minister's questions and they will say, yeah, Prime Minister's questions are a really effective way of scrutiny. They get to ask questions. What you're really looking for is for them to say, and on this day, this question was asked, and then this happened as a result of it. So always linking your points to concrete examples, making sure you're being as specific as possible so the kids have got like a lot to grip onto is really helpful. The role of backbenchers I'll look at here. This tends to be a weaker topic. Again, it's a place where the examples are quite sparse and you have to be quite clever with your language when you write an essay. I'll use this to talk about Private Members Bill. There's a really good video by Parliament about how this works on YouTube, so I'd search that out and show the kids. And I also talk about the potential rebellions here. Remind the kids, though, that you can be a backbencher and part of the government's party. So you can be a Tory and be rebelling against the Tories. They sometimes get a little bit confused there. But always bring it back to impact. It's always about how much impact does this have on the executive. If it doesn't have impact, they have to acknowledge that. Otherwise, it almost feels like an unfinished part of the course. And then I look at sovereignty. So I only touch on it because we come back to this like a couple times, like when we do executive and then when we do the judiciary, well, the relations between branches, and we cover the judiciary. So I only kind of touch on this sovereignty here. They know what sovereignty is. We've covered it in the first topic. But here I start to point out like the Parliament versus executive and how we have a very strong majority executive at the minute, and that makes it quite hard for sovereignty to exist. So that's kind of how I run through the spec. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I hope I've pointed out a few examples and kind of pitfalls for you. Common problems that I found in my first couple of years of teaching, lack of depth in examples, so they don't answer the question. You know, it will be asking about evaluate the extent to which committees are better at scrutinising than the judiciary, and they'll be like, yeah, committees are really good because, you know, they can do this, but they won't talk about the impact. There's just not enough depth, so they're not answering the question. So be aware of that. Don't overdo it, but just maybe pick a few really good examples that you hammer home quite a lot. Tricky questions. I've got a really bad spelling error in that. Significance is spelled very dodgily there, sorry. But tricky questions can really catch a kid out if they are just too weak on that area. Like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, if we'd done a backbenchers question, that would have really thrown a lot of my kids. Now I really focus on that because I know it could come up. One of the questions a couple of years ago, even last year, was evaluate the extent to which it said something about the Lords being more powerful than the Commons in reality or something like that. And that really threw kids because they knew the Lords could do stuff, they knew the Commons could do stuff, but they couldn't put together the fact that the Lords was more powerful than the Commons. That was quite a difficult way to look at it. So when you've finished planning or you've finished the topic and you think I've got a few more lessons, what would be the most disgusting things you could be asked for Parliament, and then look into that and kind of do your own research into it. What I will end up doing is usually when I'm asking them to plan a question, I will plan it first, so that because I can do that in my head, but if I've got it written down and I've looked stuff up, I can have some really good solid examples, and they say to me, I haven't got an example for this committee. Another good thing to think about is theory versus reality in their understanding. So in theory, Parliament is sovereign, but in reality, executive tends to be more dominant. That's a really good way to add some edge to their essays and add some evaluation points. If they can't do that, they're really limiting themselves. So be thinking about, well, this is what it's supposed to look like, but this is what actually happens. And the last bit, which is actually what I do first, is tell them that Parliament and government are different things. That can really ruin a question if they're talking about Parliament and actually the question's about the government or the executive. So just really hammer home what that is. I always use a little picture of the Commons and draw out where the front benches sit. But by the way, you've still got Parliament behind them and Parliament in front of them. So finally then, I always give my kids knowledge organisers. These aren't perfect, but it's a good way to get those examples that I want them to remember written down and in front of them. This is an older version, so I've actually improved some of this since then, because it does say that the Shops Bill was the last time a government was defeated. That's not true. Brexit ruined that. I had to literally update it as the news was coming out. But yeah, I have these knowledge organisers. They all get them at the beginning of the year. And on the back, they have key debates and practice questions for them to work through. I'd like to say they do that. I'm not entirely sure they do. But it's a really nice resource to have if you're thinking about challenging them. So I put the backbencher question on there so they have that if they want it. So that's how I teach the Parliament part of the spec. I hope that's helpful to you, and I will be making some more videos on the other topics.